as the Executive Director of Kandy-based think tank, Global Vision, Center for Knowledge Advancement, I have great pleasure in warmly welcoming Dr. Randall Kuhn from USA. For this inaugural presentation, it will be followed by a series of such programs in future. Dr. Randall is the Assistant Professor and Director of Global Health Affairs Program of the University of Denver, Colorado. He will share with us his observations and findings of the studies done by him on tsunami in Sri Lanka. Dr. Randall, so am I correct in understanding that your work has been mostly on reconstruction work?
It began as looking at reconstruction and looking a little bit, trying to look at some of the outcomes. So I was able to get access to data on 5th grade examination pass rates at schools in the local areas. But what began to happen as I started to work was that it became clear that the interest of my study was looking at some of the regional differences in light of the political conflict and ethnic troubles, but also just looking at how some communities are more effective than others. And in the process of doing this study, though, it became very clear that this tsunami this disaster was very different than almost any we've seen before, that the level of donor involvement was so huge, it was enormous, and so that changed a lot of the dimensions of what I've been looking at. The other thing that I noticed was, typically in doing a kind of impact evaluation, the assumption that you have to make is that the tsunami, the disaster, is somehow random, that the communities, the study groups, the East and the South, don't differ in sort of their trajectory of development or change. And one thing I realized very quickly is that there is no obvious comparison between the East and the South, because they're quite different. And that sort of led me down the path that I'm on this trip, which is to really look at what were the political, socioeconomic, and cultural forces that led to the differences in, say, affected communities in the South and the East. So particularly, how did patterns of migration lead some people to be living near the sea?
Yeah, now that's very interesting, because most of us in this part of the country are not that familiar with the East,
right,
compared to South.
Right.
So can you elaborate more on it and tell us more specifically about the things you noticed in the East compared to South?
Right. I'll get a little bit more into this in my talk, but for the most part, what you see is that the East was a fairly unpopulated area, or relatively unpopulated, that the South has always been crowded, and that the East has become more crowded over the years. And sometimes you go to some of the towns in the East, and like villages in the South, they look very crowded and they're built up. So you go to Tsunami or Kalmune or Matasumune, and they have 4- or 5-story upstairs buildings. But for the most part, the growth has happened with people moving to the coast. There are all these unsettled areas on the coast, coconut plantations, jungle, crown land, and of course there are lands on the interior. And this is what we know in the literature globally on how developing countries and rich countries accommodate population growth. People live in the most desirable areas first, and then they either move inland or they move even closer to the coast. And in this country, most of the economic opportunities are on the coast, and there's been often a war or some kind of trouble going on in the interior. And the interior lands are often very valuable for rice production. So people have moved towards the coast, and that's taken on a number of different forms. So a number of Tamil communities have been displaced due to the war, or displaced due to local conflicts with the Muslim community, or just sold land, and they've ended up on the beach, particularly lower caste populations. At the same time, the Muslim community, even wealthy families, have built buildings towards the beach. And so you basically have a situation where most of the people who died in the tsunami in the East would not have been there 60 years ago, or even 30 years ago, most of them. And that many of those people were uniquely vulnerable, meaning they were displaced populations, possibly poor, possibly unable to function effectively. And of course, within the Tamil community, many of the most capable people migrated abroad. And so what you have left is sort of a group that was in very difficult circumstances and sort of already vulnerable.
Okay, I know this is, you can't give a direct answer to this question, but can you tell us something about your broad opinion about the reconstruction work we have done so far?
I think overall it's been amazing and unprecedented. The level of financial commitment has been incredible. The effectiveness of much of the work has been amazing. You'll hear people in the East also saying, that this tsunami, they have this term, the golden wave, and some people can say that kind of cynically, that people are making a profit off the tsunami, but also what they mean is that there are genuine opportunities for development that have emerged from this concept of building back better, is what they say in the donor community. But building back better does carry risks. One, obviously, is corruption. One is that certain non-essential services will be provided more to preferred areas. So the typical story that you hear a lot about is the number of homes that were built in Hambantota relative to the rest of the country. But also you just have the fact that you're a businessman, so each additional unit that you spend on something is likely to be spent less efficiently. And so you start having these grand schemes where people are, in Hambantota, thousands of people were moved from the beach, far away from the beach. So overall, but overall you'd say the effort's been amazing. The success in many ways has been good. The buffer zone obviously created some difficulties in people building back at all, and created a lot of, I think, grudges and grievances, and those are mistakes that, probably if you had it to do over again, you wouldn't do them. But overall, you'd say the effort's been amazing, and you just, as a foreigner, you wonder why we can't make this kind of effort in all disasters. So why the earthquake in Kashmir received so much less funding than the tsunami in Sri Lanka and Indonesia.
Okay, let me ask you the direct question.
Okay.
If you take the tsunami construction first, in isolation, of course with all the dimensions and the factors involved with it, do you consider it to be a success story or a failure or something in between?
Right. I think it's difficult to say. I mean, I think a lot's been done well, but I think ultimately to call it a success, any project of this magnitude is bound to be its success. Ultimately, is bound to be determined by the conditions that existed before. And the fact is, that there is a war going on, and there are communities that the communities hardest hit by the tsunami were vulnerable. So we can think about Batikaloa as a place that was vulnerable. In Ampara, we can say overall Ampara is less well off than the south. But we can also say that no one really this is probably the biggest contribution of my work, is no one has really understood the amount, the extent to which the Ampara impact was actually Tamil, not Muslim, and that these were Tamil communities that were incredibly, they needed not just as much as the South, but they needed more, because these were poor, displaced, vulnerable communities, and not all of what should have happened, and that's bound to occur in any context. So what you're left with is any work that happens in the East has the potential to be undone very quickly. Some work that was not done in the East is still going on. So, in general, more was done in the South, particularly in the housing sector. Yeah. What was done in the East was delayed by about 3 years, and that creates problems, and it creates grievances. And the big concern that I have is about this buffer zone, is that there was this whole elaborate system built around this buffer zone, but I think a lot of people who know the environmental justice literature don't believe that the buffer zone can hold. That eventually people are going to forget about the buffer zone, and that typically what you see is that a constituency who represents some number of votes will say, I would like to move in there. And some bureaucrat will say, no, that's the buffer zone. And they'll say, what are you talking about? I know what you're talking about, let's say the tsunami. And they'll say, that was 30, 40 years ago, we don't care about the tsunami. I want my people on this beach. And that creates vulnerability when people, that eventually people are going to want to move to the coast. And until people are free to practice their job or their craft and live where they want to, there's always going to be this kind of wrangling over people trying to make it towards the coast so some other group doesn't get there first. and it's a real challenge.
Okay, thank you very much.